Thank you to all of those who made it out at 8 o'clock this morning. I'd like to do a presentation this morning that's really in two parts. The first part is a question and the research that Brian wanted me to talk about, which is science computationally reproducible, or what we call push-button replicable? And it turns out that that question really comes down to the question of, do scientists provide replication files or share their data and their code for push-button replication? And the second part of the presentation is meant, I hope, to encourage some discussion and debate, and it will be around what are the ethics of replication research. So push-button replication, as we call it, we tried to come up with a name that evoked as much as possible exactly what it was we were trying to do. And it's a question, if I run the same code on the same data as the original paper, will I be able to reproduce the published results? Seems like Science 101. But it turns out that when you ask that question, it really comes down to, well, presuming you can get the data and the code. So I and my co-authors were not the first nor the last to try and address this question. So here are some other examples. Vickerts in 2006 did a similar exercise. They had a sample of 141 psychology articles. These were cases where the authors had all signed principles that included data sharing for reanalysis. And what they found is when they requested the data, only 27% of the sets of authors shared the data for reanalysis. 73% did not. Here's another example, more recent, from hydrology. Here they used a sample of 360 articles. These were all published in journals that either required or strongly encouraged that the articles state how data could be accessed for reanalysis. And so even though in the early stages they found 175 cases where they could find some data and perhaps some code, there were only 20 of 360 that had complete replication files, that is, complete directions, code, and data. And of those, only 4 then they were able to fully computationally reproduce. Here's an example from economics. Chang and Lee had a sample of 67 empirical macroeconomics articles from 13 journals. And what they found is that of the 67, 29 were indeed push-button replicable. And of those, the majority were cases where the data were already public, but some were cases where they requested data. That means that 38 were not push-button replicable, and all of those were cases where some or all of the data were not made available by the original authors. So they also break this down by the requirements of the journal in which the article was published, and we see, not surprisingly, that the push-button replicability is higher in the journals that required public data as part of publication, but there were some cases from journals that didn't have this requirement where they were still able to get the replication files and successfully reproduce the published results. So what about our paper? This is research joint with Ben Wood and Rui Mueller. This is a sample of 109 studies that were drawn from journals that had varying policies. So since this is my research, I'm going to go into a little bit more of the details. So here we're looking at development impact evaluations. These are studies that measure an effect of a program or an intervention carried out in a lower middle income country using experimental or quasi-experimental methodologies. So the idea, and I'm an economist, so I realize this might sound fuzzy, but the idea is that it's an attempt to construct statistically or experimentally a counterfactual in order to measure a net effect of a program. And we focused on these studies partly because that was our job at the time to look at development impact evaluations, but partly because for development studies, a single study, a single finding can be highly policy influential. There isn't as much research, the need for evidence is much greater, and so it's an area where we feel it's even more important that we look at the replicability of the research that we're using to make policy. And also, we think it's an interesting sample because we have research using similar methods, but across a wide variety of disciplines. So our methods, we really wanted to be as neutral as possible and as transparent as possible carrying out this project. So we developed a protocol which we piloted and then we posted it publicly. We had clear classifications for how the replication researchers should compare their results from pushing the button to the original article. And they had to pre-specify the key results from the original article, those for which they would make the determination on the comparability. And we wanted to be transparent, so we set this up on the Open Science framework with the protocol. The key results were all posted there before the push-button replications were started, and so on. So what did we find? Each square in this figure represents one article. So the black squares, 59 out of 109 articles, there was no access to the replication files. And 30 of these 59 were articles published in journals that had data sharing requirements at that time. For 15 articles, we received incomplete data and code. So we were able to do some replication, but not all of the tables in the article. 3, we did classify as proprietary. In order to do that, they had to prove that it was proprietary data, but they also had to provide their code. So they had to show that they were willing to share and they really just couldn't. And so the last 32, the green squares here, are the cases for which we did receive complete replication files. And the news here is pretty good. The dark green, 27, the replications were comparable to the original articles, and the light green are cases where we found minor differences. So of those 15 where the files were incomplete, we did ask the replication researchers who were involved to make a classification of the comparability. And here we see that 10 had comparable findings for what we could replicate, 4 had minor differences, and 1 had major differences. So not too surprisingly, the likelihood of finding some differences was higher for cases where the authors were unable or unwilling to provide us with complete files. So this is looking at just the data access question by the journals. There were 10 journals in our sample, and as you can see, we had half that you might think of as public health journals, so Lancet and AIDS and Behavior, and the other half were social science, 3 pretty strongly economics, and 2 we'd consider development journals. And I can tell you later how we created this sample. I don't have time now, but it was interesting. It was a coincidence that we ended up with half and half in terms of the journals. And so you can see here that the social sciences seem to have a better record at data sharing than the public health. So the 2 with the star, American Economic Journal Applied Economics, and +1, those were the 2 journals that said you have to make data available upon request if you publish in our journal. And the authors in AEJ did very well. All of them shared data, except for 2 where they were proprietary. +1, not so good. Right? A little over a quarter of those articles, the authors were willing and able to provide us with replication files. Journal Development Economics is the journal for which there was a public data requirement as part of publication. Only 1 in 5 in our sample had public data, so the data were already posted at the time that we started. But almost a quarter of them eventually did provide replication files for our research. We also coded the funder for all of the funders, so some of these had multiple funders, for the articles in our sample. And these are the 3 funders for which we had the most observations. And you can see very different results. So for studies funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, only a little over a quarter shared the replication files. For National Institutes of Health, it was just about a half. For the World Bank, it was over 3/4. So the conclusions for the first part of my presentation are we still have a long way to go in terms of changing the culture around data sharing if we want to do replication science. The journals are starting to make a difference, but they don't go far enough. And in particular, there's non-compliance. We see high non-compliance in some journals with the requirement that authors simply make data available upon request. Now, it's hard to really judge the first question about computational reproducibility without having more data, but some of the results are encouraging. At least in the social sciences. So for those that we found that the results were very comparable, and also the results of Cheng and Lee suggested that as long as they could get the replication files, they could indeed reproduce the original results. Some of the newer studies looking at this question about data sharing are also starting to focus more on the question of raw data versus estimation files. We didn't make that distinction. All right, so we completed this push-button replication project, and we submitted it to PLOS One, and they immediately came back and said, "Where's your ethics statement?" And we said, well, we're economists, so we don't have an ethics statement. We didn't even think about it. So we went and looked at some of the other research that has a similar research question, including the studies that I talked about at the very beginning, and almost none of them has any kind of ethical statement. We found one where the ethical statement was ethical approval, not required. So we felt a little bit better about the fact that we didn't have one, and so we wrote an ethics statement where we focused on the fact that nothing about our research was revealing anything about the original participants in these studies, that all of the data that we were requesting and receiving was de-identified, so there was no risk to the original participants, and we were simply essentially auditing the data and the code. So after we got the paper accepted, we went back to the editor we were working with at PLOS One, and we said, so our intent all along was to be very transparent here, and now we want to open up all the pages on Open Science Framework so people can see the results of the push-button replication exercise for each of the included studies. And we want to make sure that's okay. And the editor said, well, that's a good question. Let me go talk to some people. And he went away and he came back and emailed us and said, no. Obviously, this is PLOS One, so you need to make data available upon request. We made it public, but he said, needs to be de-identified. So we said, okay, well, we want publication, so we're going to do what he says. And we looked around again at some of these other studies to see what the experiences are, and the experience is mixed. There's certainly cases where people report, again, the share of studies, whether data were made available or not, but they don't reveal what articles are included or the results of an individual study. But certainly there are cases where you can find the complete data, all of the articles, whether the data were there, and what the results of the push-button replication attempt were. So all of this left us a little confused and frustrated. And the implication of the decision of the editor at PLOS One seemed to be that the authors in our sample were somehow human subjects in this research. And then, of course, if we're worried about not identifying them, that implies as well that there's some risk to them of being identified in this research. And so that led me back to a question that I'd already been thinking about quite a bit, which is replication research the study of research or of researchers? So we can think about this question in light of some types of research that is adjacent. So first, my first thought was, well, what happens in meta-analysis or in systematic review? Now, these are studies where the research question is really about the evidence or the results. So if we put all of these studies together, what can we find as the aggregate result? But nonetheless, there's a lot of judgment going on about authors of original studies that are included in systematic reviews. And in fact, a good systematic review is required to do critical appraisal of all of the included studies and include a table in the paper that lists each of the studies with the critical appraisal, meaning low risk of bias, medium risk of bias, and high risk of bias. And these judgments are based on how the original researchers conducted the research. And I've never seen the case where the original authors in a systematic review jump up and down and say, you have no right. You have no right to judge our paper like that out in the open, right? And Karen Robinson confirmed this for me, and she reminded me that, in fact, people get upset when you don't include their studies in a systematic review because you've somehow suggested that their information isn't good enough, their evidence isn't good enough to be included. Well, what about Metascience? Think about the research that we learned about yesterday morning. Now, this is research about how we do research. And if we think about the studies yesterday morning, certainly there were lots of individual studies that were included, but it wasn't so much focusing on any in particular study and how they conducted research. It was larger questions about how do we do science. But when it comes to replication, there does seem to be a difference. It's kind of this combination of wanting to understand something about the findings or the results in a particular study, but also wanting to look at something about how that research was done. And further to the point, replication research is not really meaningful unless we can point to the original study, right? I mean, it doesn't do us any good to say that that result is reproducible or robust if we're not saying to what, right, or against what. And so, in effect, the decision of the author, the editor +1 was to say, we're going to make your research a meta-science study and not about replication. Well, if we think that replication research then is different, that it is both wanting to understand more about the result, but also wanting to look at how the research was conducted for named studies, that brings up a question of ethics. And here I mean, what are the concepts of right and wrong conduct when we conduct this kind of research? So most of my thoughts around this were actually formed earlier, before the push-button replication project, when I was supervising the 3IE replication program. And this is, I guess, still going. I'm not at 3IE any longer. That funds replication studies. Now here, replication, again, is the reanalysis of the data from the original study. And these grants were meant to fund research beyond, well, we didn't even include push-button replication then, but we expected them to start with pure replication, which is the kind of thing that Shirley talked about yesterday, where you take their data and what they said they did and see if you can reproduce that, and then also to go on and ask some more questions about robustness to measurement and estimation choices, for example. And so because we gave the grants for this, and we set up some of the rules, we ended up being the third party in between the original authors and the replication researcher. So that's me in the middle. As Tim said, from his experience, I've got lots of stories to share. You want to have a beer? Even better, single malt scotch. I can tell you a lot of stories about being that person in the middle. But those stories lead me to think about some domains that we might consider for what would be called replication ethics. And because I want you to know that this is made up rubbish, I did indeed come up with a framework where everything starts with the same letter. So refusal, requirements, rhetoric, review, and reply. So refusal is just simply this idea of consent. If indeed the original authors are human subjects in replication research, do they have some right to informed consent, meaning that they can refuse, meaning they can even refuse to have you say that you asked them to participate and they said no? Certainly, this was one of our original authors in the replication program, simply wrote back and said, we would prefer not to participate. Then that person went to our funder and said, you should revoke their funding for this. The second is requirements, and we found this both in the push-button replication and in the replication program, which is this idea that when the data sharing is a data available upon request, we often see that people, the original authors say, data made available upon reasonable request. And then reasonable opens up this opportunity for them to say, well, who are you? What are your credentials? What's the research question that you have using our data? Please submit your entire pre-analysis plan before we make a decision about whether or not you are worthy to receive our data. And we saw this a lot. In the replication program, we had original authors who would say, I'm sorry, but those replication researchers are not reputable enough to be trying to replicate my research. Rhetoric. Now, there are two pieces to rhetoric here. One has to do with what we mean when we say replication that becomes so crucial if what we want to follow that with is the word success or failure. And scientists seem hardwired to want to do that. It's like the minute I hear the word replication, I have to be able to say success or failure. Even yesterday after Tim's presentation, there was somebody up here talking to him and he said, now I want to understand exactly which ones of the studies are you going to code as failure? Is it going to be a failure if they didn't respond to your request? We certainly ran into researchers who said the only time you can use the word replication is for a push-button replication. Because anything beyond that involves some decision-making on the part of the replication researcher, and so that's a new study. So if it's anything beyond a push-button replication, you can't call it a replication because there's no way to judge whether the original paper is successfully or not replicated. But there are also a lot of concerns about the language that replication researchers use in the studies that they write up. Some replication researchers want to use words like mistake and error. Those of you in the room who are economists are likely familiar with the Herndon, Ash, and Pullen replication study of Reinhardt and Rogoff. And in this study, they used the word error 45 times. I think they were trying to make a point. Now, some of those times, the word was correctly used. That is, they could point to a mistake. They could point to, in the Excel file, they selected these cells when, in fact, they said that they were using those cells. That was a mistake that we found. But there were other times when they used the word error when it was really a matter of judgment or interpretation. Okay, so there are questions there about conduct. Review. Now, Tim talked about this a little bit yesterday as well when he said we actually allowed the original authors to be referees, or we asked original authors to be referees when we submitted both the registered reports and the final studies. We ran into this a lot as well. The original authors, in fact, would say to us, you have to let us review and approve it before anything is made public because we're sure they're going to make mistakes. But on the other hand, sometimes the question is whether there's a responsibility to review. So if the replication researcher says, I can't make this work, but please help me, look at this and see if you can help, right? A lot of what Shirley talked about was this kind of request, going back to the original authors and saying, help us figure this out, review it for us, please. And then the question is, do they have the responsibility to do that, or can they say, we don't care what you find, we're just gonna discount it no matter what you find, so do what you want. And then, of course, the question of the timing of the review. So in cases where you're doing reproduction or external replication, that is, you're doing an experiment over again, then you have the opportunity to have the original authors review the protocol, and so that's kind of an easier time to include the review. But in the case of desk replication or internal replication, where you're working with the data, what they really want to do, what the original authors often want to do, is to have a review after the research is completed. So my final R is reply. Now, I put this, selected this picture for another version of this presentation because the anecdote that I told had to do with a replication paper called High Noon for Microfinance Impact Evaluation. So I looked for a High Noon picture and I put it in my presentation, and then I kind of sat back and I said, okay, actually, wow, perfect metaphor. Because so often original authors actually take this as being a duel. And so they would say, we need to be able to publish our reply at exact the same time. We need to be able to pull our guns out at exactly the same time as the replication researchers so that we can shoot. And I found it funny, even Tim talked yesterday about when they all come out guns blazing. So same kind of metaphor about how replication research often ends up playing out. So my second set of conclusions here really is just that it does seem like replication research is a little bit different, that no matter how hard we try, the original authors often perceive themselves as being human subjects of this kind of research. And therefore, I think in order to advance this kind of science, which I think is really critical, it behooves us to think about what are the ethics of replication research and how can we mitigate some of these challenges that we face. Thank you. This took me like 35 minutes last night, and now I came in at 25. So I must have either talked really fast or left all the interesting stuff out. All right.
Thank you, Annette. My name is Jelte Wicherts. I'm from Tilburg University. I'm a meta-researcher with a background in psychology who has also done some work on data sharing, as you indicated. Thank you for your interesting talk. I can tell you a lot of stories, I won't, about my backs and forths with the ethics review board, the editors in meta-research. Also, my exchanges with the ethics panel of the European Research Council, who were happy to give me money, but demanded me to have informed consent procedures for any meta-research that I was doing. The last word about that, in the last exchange with the ERC ethics panel, I still have to have, but I'm convinced now that researchers doing research cannot say, I want to remain anonymous. Any reuse of the data, and this is, if you look at the European privacy laws, insofar that the goal of the research, the follow-up research, replication in your case, which is typically what we talk about, insofar that the goals of that replication are similar to the goals of the original research, it's definitely a legitimate interest, both from a legal standpoint and from an ethical standpoint. So I think, but I do agree with you that we have to think about the ethics here. So my question to you would be, do you see any room for journals, editors, publishers and funders perhaps, where they make sure and explicit that if you do research and publish it, that you cannot play the I want to remain anonymous cards?
I see a lot of room. So first of all, I fully agree with you that if you're going to conduct research and you expect it to be published and people to cite it, that you should be open to this. I think there's a lot of room for journals and funders. I think the funders have actually come along faster than the journals. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation does have a requirement, which I think now they are enforcing more than they were back then. NIH has a requirement that I don't know that they've ever enforced, but they may be starting to enforce now. But we do see, and we see funders saying not just that the requirement is that you must share the data upon request, but that in order to get your final payment, we expect to see the public files. The journals, I think, are coming along more slowly, but I think that because there is research, I know not much of the research conducted by people in this room, but there actually are people who just conduct research using their own time and not huge labs, and so they're not beholden to funders. It's going to be critical that the journals play a role in this. And I really think that ultimately it's going to need to be requirements that these things are just posted publicly to begin with, and not all of this made available upon request.
Daniel Goldhaven wrote a book called Worse Than War, where he's studying genocide. And he had the insight that I thought was remarkable of framing the issue of genocide as a political question. The reasons why people commit genocide is because they can get away. It's a political maneuver. And I was thinking of this when you were talking about the power dynamics in the conversations people were having behind the scenes about replication and about the role of the underlying question of, is my science valid, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of power dynamics going on in the background. So my question to you is, should we be thinking of this as a political issue? Like this is actually to do with politics and influence and funding and how much, people will listen to me and all this kind of stuff. And if we do that, does that then give us more insight into understanding the motivations and the levers through which we can, as a community, turn the screws a little bit and get people to comply and be better citizens? in this community. So is this a political question?
So I just need to go on record here that he is the one who likened replication research to genocide, not me.
I did not, but never mind.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very interesting question. I think, I guess I'm an economist, so I don't know exactly how to define politics, but what I would say is that a big part of this question has to do with the processes which include politics around the way science is done and recognized and published. And so certainly the politics of how I establish my reputation and what that means for my funding and the hierarchies that we have in science may play a big role in all of this. So is the question, if we think about solving this from a politics standpoint instead of an ethics standpoint, I think that's very interesting. I guess one of the reasons why I went with ethics is because I think that scientists and researchers do think about ethics, that there are ethics questions that we're supposed to consider, and maybe less likely to want to see themselves in a political realm.
Yeah, and the reason I'm asking is because I think politics is a blind, we're not really explicitly talking about it, so it's a blind spot, and I think it's important to shine a light on that kind of idea.
I agree.
And to follow the previous comment, because I'm in the second, first, okay. So Yuri Lizebnik, I'm at Site Inc., and my background is cancer research, and I'm interested in the topic of this conference and this conference itself, because at some point I started to ask this question, how is it possible to publish 2 million papers on cancer, and with the results that we all know they are. What I wanted to follow is that on the second day of the conference, and this is the first time I think, except of Tim Harrington's answering a question yesterday, saying that you need to disconnect the results from the livelihood of the scientist, as is the only options he sees after fighting all this long fight. And it brought up this quote. I'll read it because, not to miss any word, but one of my favorite from American writer Upton Sinclair, who said, it is difficult, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it, right? And until this point is discussed, we can wring our hands, use sarcasm or anything else, tell about people who are not, giving away the data and everything else. But unless we talk about it, what happened that this connection between the livelihood and what the person does became so strong? What happened and how it can be corrected? I think it all will be, it's another thing that, I've asthma, it's triggered by dust mites. And if my doctor would tell me only use this inhaler and be using it all the time and you need to monitor it and so on, I would be suffering. But he would also tell me, look, get rid of dust and mold in your house and then you'll be fine. You won't even need to use the inhaler. So we need to find out what the dust mites are and the poop that they make us, suffer, and, get rid of it. And we need to be honest about discussing it because we all are subject to it as well in the matter of reflexivity. So this is just my comment.
So yeah, and I think that there's lots of dust mites that we're looking at here. There are rewards to having papers that are highly influential, and so when you have one of those papers, you certainly don't want those results to somehow be questioned. There are rewards to publishing things that look creative or unconventional, and it turns out that those findings might, and we saw a lot about this yesterday, that these kind of striking findings are probably more likely to regress to the mean when we replicate them either internally or externally. And so again, then it becomes risky to me to have this research conducted when I got a reward in science by having one of these really interesting results. So.
But the thing is, since it's meta-science and real science, maybe it's time to look at the mirror and say, are these rules imposed from outside or we made them? And if we made them, can we change them?
Right. Well, and I think this is where journals and journal practices can make a big difference. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Nick DeVito. I'm University of Oxford. But So I wonder if you, or if you think authors, see a distinction between requesting data for replication and requesting it for secondary data analysis. And then as a follow-on to that is, should we see a difference? Should there be a difference there, or should it be agnostic? Should a request for data essentially be agnostic to whatever you want to use it for?
Well, I think there is a difference. That doesn't mean that I think there's a greater excuse for not sharing it. Original authors definitely see a difference, and I think that's one of the reasons why they feel like they should be able to screen people who request the data for what they want to do with it. And one of the papers, and maybe it is Yelta's, said that that it seemed like there was a difference when authors thought that the data was going to be used for meta-analysis, that was okay, but when the data were going to be used just for looking at computational reproducibility, that was not okay. So I think original authors do perceive these differences. I'm not sure that they should matter in whether or not they share the data.
Thank you.
I'm Samin Vizier. I'm at University of California at Davis in psychology. And I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on what I perceive to be, I don't know if you do, an asymmetry between the ethical concerns that are raised when the issue is criticism or critique of a paper versus positive comments about a paper. So it becomes very salient to the original authors that there might be ethical issues with naming names about which papers aren't reproducible or whatever, but when they're getting praise, when it's getting hyped, by others or by themselves, no one raises ethical issues, even though that can do a lot of harm and be irresponsible, just like inaccurate negative statements about the research can do a lot of harm. And along with that, thinking about who are the stakeholders. So the authors clearly have a stake in whether people say inaccurate, positive, or negative things about their paper, but so do the consumers of the research or a lot of other people. And what are the ethics of allowing inaccurate, positive or negative statements about a paper to be said, and why do we focus so much on the negative and not on the inaccurate positive comments that are made about papers?
Well, that's a very good question. And I have seen examples of cases where there's been a replication study that then somebody criticizes the replication study and says, and typically a replication study that's supportive of the original, and then people say, well, they made the same mistake or they made a different mistake. And so there definitely is some of that. I don't think that we see it as often. So I think, this is where I would love to see just a lot of people doing a lot of replication research, right? And so one of the reasons that we funded the program where we were paying for replication studies to be conducted and where we were going ahead and posting them online, and then we worked very hard to get them published in a journal, the first set, was so that every study that was funded would be made public regardless of the findings, so that the replication studies that said, wow, we twisted this every which way and that, and these findings are really robust. And so we really think that this evidence should be used for policymaking because of what we did. And I would love to see more of that research conducted and made public, but boy, that's the last thing in the world that a journal wants to publish.
Okay, yeah, hi, I'm Jörg Heber, I'm editor-in-chief of PLOS ONE. Yeah, just some comments on the ethics question. So one of the items is obviously that you contact researchers via email when you do that research. So it does go beyond the published paper itself. We do publish, obviously, even our journal was also our journal, and many others do publish negative comments on published papers, also our own, obviously. I don't think this is an issue, and obviously any negative comment, I mean, there should not be anonymity for this. It should be open and published. The ethics question is more like if you do experiments or if you do a research with a replication where you contact authors, ask for the underlying raw data, and have this kind of additional interaction. And I would very much welcome, like, if ethics, IRBs, ethics panels assess these kind of interactions, and if this kind of ethics angle is looked at. I don't think it should be about whether the paper is reproducible or replicable or not. I mean, if it's not replicable, it should be said, but it's about that angle of the research where I think ethics issues come in. We do also require, normally the data should be shared. It's not necessarily all the raw data. But I would be interested in having the instances where you did not get the data from the researchers. And I'm happy if you contact me about that. Happy to follow up on this. But for me, it's more like the angle that you contact researchers and that this influences the outcome of that, where the ethics come in.
Right. And so the interesting thing is when we started this, we thought we were being super fair. So we thought by saying, we're not just going to see whether the data are public, we're going to give the authors a second chance. We're going to reach out and let them give us the data. We actually thought we were being more fair. And, you know, we're economists, so we weren't thinking about ethics. So we didn't really think about, oh, suddenly they're human subjects because we've requested information from them. And so I get that, but I think you're right. We need to look at that carefully because human subject is not just about the interaction, it's about whether there's a risk. And so can we make the decision that these interactions are ethical by design because these are researchers who have published their research and therefore should not be excluded for these reasons. And so, yeah, those are exactly some of the questions that I think we should ask. Again, I think one of the unfortunate things is that by not being able to make this information public, nobody knows what the 27 studies were where we were able to receive all the replication files and the push-button replications were totally comparable. We did name and fame one person in the paper who had 5 studies in our sample, and all of them were fully push-button replicable, and apparently he didn't mind because he tweeted out, hey, look, I showed up in their paper as doing this. But I agree with you. These are all really important questions that we need to look at. All right, thank you very much.